what if history's most famous religious figures weren't actually trying to start a religion at all?
Right.
Like, what if the words we've used for centuries, the very vocabulary of our faiths, have been deliberately mistranslated by ancient empires?
It's a huge question.
It is, and specifically mistranslated to hide a blueprint for a massive socioeconomic revolution.
Yeah.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you're here. If you're listening to this, you are someone who loves to learn. You're someone who isn't afraid to take a sledgehammer to conventional wisdom, right?
Absolutely.
To really unpack those complex, perspective-shifting ideas. And today, I mean, we have an incredibly fascinating and, frankly, a pretty radical mission for this deep dive. We are going to explore a profound reinterpretation of theology, history, and socioeconomic governance.
We really are. And we're working from a very specific, very dense stack of sources today.
Oh yeah, dense is the right word.
Seriously. We are looking at translated excerpts and highly detailed linguistic analyses of Quranic lectures. Specifically, we're zooming in on Surah Al-Imran, verses 52 through 58.
Right.
Now, what makes this source material so unique is the framework it uses to translate and interpret these verses. It utilizes the al-Kitab methodology.
Okay, al-Kitab.
Yes, which was developed by the 20th century thinker Allama G. Parwez.
Got it. And before we get into the weeds of how this methodology completely, flips history on its head, we need to set the stage here.
Definitely.
We need to lay down some very clear ground rules because the sources we're looking at today, they touch on deeply held foundational religious narratives.
Right, involving Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Exactly. And they deal with highly charged socio-political and economic concepts, like concepts that have historically sparked wars and massive revolutions.
So let me just establish those ground rules right up front for us and for you listening, because these topics are, well, they're so sensitive.
Super sensitive.
And they are so foundational to the worldviews of billions of people across the globe. So I want to be crystal clear here. Our goal in this deep dive is absolutely not to take sides.
Not at all.
We are not here to endorse the viewpoints presented in these texts, nor are we here to debunk them. We aren't here to tell you what to believe about history or theology.
Right. Just consider us neutral tour guides in a very intense intellectual museum.
Precisely. Our mission is purely analytical today. We're going to impartially unpack the arguments, dissect the linguistic retranslations, and, examine the historical claims exactly as they're presented in Parwez's source material.
I was just looking at the architecture.
Exactly, the architecture of the argument. We're going to look at how the author builds this case step by step, word by classical Arabic word.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because to even begin to understand the specific historical reinterpretations in this text, we can't just jump straight to the ancient historical figures.
Right, you'd be totally lost.
We have to first grasp the foundational philosophical lens the author uses to view the entire world.
Yes.
The entire text, like everything we were going to talk about today, it hinges on this massive structural clash between two completely incompatible operating systems for human society.
Operating systems is a great way to put it.
Yeah, and those two systems are defined in the text as din and mazhab.
Din and mazhab.
Now, I've heard the word din used in casual conversation just to mean like religion or faith.
Yeah.
But the source draws a massive, sharp, almost aggressive distinction between these two concepts, right?
It is a completely polarized distinction. In Parwez's framework, translating din as simply religion is actually part of the historical corruption he is trying to expose.
Wait, really? The translation itself is the corruption?
According to the source, yes. Din is not a religion. It is defined as a comprehensive, equitable, socio-economic, and political system,
Right.
one that operates based on divine laws. The key operative word here is system. It's an active, governing reality.
So, if it's not a religion in the way we usually think of it, what does this system actually look like in practice, according to the text? Like, what's the day-to-day?
Well, in a society operating under din, basic human rights are not just these abstract moral concepts. They are systemically guaranteed.
How?
The text repeatedly uses the concept of sustenance, or quite literally bread and economic provision, which it terms rububiyat.
Rububiyat.
Right. In the framework of din, rububiyat is the fundamental responsibility of the social order. You do not have to beg for your basic needs. Sustenance is a right of existence.
Wow.
It's baked right into the very legal and economic infrastructure of the society.
So to put it in modern terms, it's almost like a divinely mandated universal basic income,
Yes, exactly.
but one that encompasses healthcare, housing, and food,
Yeah.
all managed by a unified societal system. And it's not treated as charity.
That is exactly the point the author makes. In Din, giving someone food is not a charitable act that, earns the giver spiritual points while humiliating the receiver.
Right, it's not a photo op.
No. It is the fulfillment of a structural right. Now, in stark contrast to this, the source defines mazhab.
Okay, here we go.
And the author defines mazhab as a degraded, ritualistic, and fundamentally passive religion.
The word degraded is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
It really is.
How does the author argue that we get from din to mazhab? Because that's a huge downgrade.
The author argues that mazhab is what happens when din is corrupted over time by vested interests. It's basically a process of decay.
Decay? Okay.
When an equitable system threatens the wealth and power of an elite class, that elite class doesn't necessarily ban the system.
Right, because banning it creates martyrs.
Exactly. Instead of banning it, they corrupt it. They
Yeah.
strip away its socioeconomic demands and reduce it down to a set of private, spiritual rituals.
So they defang it.
They completely defang it. And when that happens, the text argues, history is actively rewritten to support a professional priesthood and to justify what we would call exploitative economic practices.
So think about how we operate today, for you listening. You probably separate your spiritual beliefs from how you pay your taxes,
Oh, absolutely.
or how you view the stock market, or how your country handles poverty.
Right.
We are taught that this separation is totally normal, like even progressive.
Right, the separation of church and state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this source argues that the very fact you separate those two things means you're currently operating inside mazhab.
Yes.
The text talks about this concept of secular dualism.
Mm.
And it paints it not as a modern progressive thing, which is how we usually view it, but as a deliberate mechanism of oppression.
It's intact.
Break that down. Explain how the source justifies calling that oppressive.
It is one of the most provocative arguments in the framework, for sure. The source argues that oppressive historical systems divide authorities specifically to subjugate the masses more efficiently.
Okay.
It's a division of labor for the ruling class. On one side, you have the political rulers, the emperors, the kings, the state apparatus.
The government.
Right. They handle the political administration, the treasury, the military, the so-called secular law.
Okay.
On the other side, you have the religious elites, the professional priests, the mullahs, the pandits, and the state gives them control over personal law, family disputes, and most importantly, spiritual salvation.
So if I'm understanding the mechanism here, din is like an open source operating system that runs the entire infrastructure of a fair society.
I like that.
Everything from the economy to the courts to the supply chain
Yeah.
runs on this single equitable code.
Yes.
Whereas mazhab is just an isolated app you're allowed to open on Sundays,
Yeah.
while the rest of your phone, your data, your battery life
Yeah.
is controlled by a corporate monopoly.
That is a phenomenal structural analogy. Under mazhab, the app of religion is allowed to exist and even encouraged by the state precisely because it is sandboxed.
It's trapped.
It doesn't have access to the root directory of the economy. It simply doesn't threaten the monopoly's bottom line.
But wait, let me push back on this, or at least, play devil's advocate for the listener here.
Please do.
Historically speaking, the separation of church and state was a hard-fought victory against theocracies that literally burned people at the stake.
True.
So why does this author argue that this dualism is actually a trap? Why is dividing the secular and the spiritual so effective at keeping people down, according to this text?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at how this dualism functions as a psychological control mechanism.
Okay.
The source explains that mazhab, this isolated ritualistic religion, it teaches passive submission to the status quo.
Oh, I see.
By taking the revolutionary, socially equitable messages of the prophets and spiritualizing them, the ruling class completely neutralizes the threat of din.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How does spiritualizing a message neutralize it?
Think about it this way. If your fundamental human rights, like that sustenance we talked about earlier, the rububiyat,
A basic income, yeah.
right, if that is controlled entirely by the secular state, you are forced into a position of subservience. You have to beg the political and economic elite for your basic needs as a favor.
as opposed to a right.
Exactly. You have to accept whatever wages they offer, whatever taxes they demand. Now, if you only have the state oppressing you, you might revolt.
Right, eventually people get hungry enough to riot.
Exactly. And that is where the second arm of the dualism comes in. While the state is starving you, the religious elite is standing at the pulpit telling you that your starvation is holy.
Oh, wow.
They tell you that poverty is a spiritual test from God. They ensure the masses look entirely to the afterlife for justice, reward, and equity rather than demanding equitable resource distribution in the present reality.
Okay, I see it now. So it's a pincer movement.
Precisely.
The state extracts your labor and resources, and the priesthood prevents you from rebelling by promising you a mansion in heaven if you just, suffer quietly on earth.
Yes. The text notes that under this system of mazhab, the religious gatekeepers are actually the primary internal architects of societal corruption.
Gatekeepers. They burden the poor with incredibly heavy, complex, self-made religious rules and rituals, things that cost money and time, while they themselves seek honor, proximity to the king, and immense wealth.
Basically a racket.
According to the source, yes. They position themselves as the exclusive gatekeepers to salvation. You have to go through them to talk to God.
Okay, so we have this philosophical foundation set. We have din, the active, equitable, socioeconomic system.
Right.
And we have mazhab, the passive, ritualistic religion that partners with the state to keep the masses docile.
That's the framework.
Now that we understand how mazhab theoretically neutralizes revolutionary movements, let's look at how the source material applies this theory to history.
This is where it gets really intense.
Yeah, because here is where the text takes an absolute sledgehammer to traditional narratives. Let's talk about how this framework interprets the historical figure of Jesus.
Okay, so this is where Parwez's methodology really challenges conventional history. The source completely, unequivocally rejects the traditional human-written historical narratives that have been passed down for 2 millennia.
Right.
It specifically calls out the historical texts, like the Gospels, as they currently exist, as being documents that were corrupted over time, specifically to depict Jesus as a passive ascetic.
Right, because the image we all know, regardless of whether we grew up in a religious household or just absorbed it through cultural osmosis, is the monk.
The wandering ascetic.
Yeah, the guy preaching total submission to the status quo, the one who says turn the other cheek, who says give to Caesar what is Caesar's, which effectively endorses the Roman tax system.
Exactly.
The ultimate passiveness completely detached from the gritty reality of state politics.
Well, according to the source material, that widely accepted image is the ultimate manufactured product of mazhab. Yes, it is a carefully curated historical fiction designed by later empires to pacify a deeply radical movement. Instead of a wandering monk, the text presents Jesus as a powerful, highly active, socio-political revolutionary.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, because we usually picture Jesus dealing exclusively in spiritual matters, right? Healing souls, talking about the kingdom of heaven as some ethereal place in the clouds.
Right, something detached from reality.
But this source frames him more like a whistleblower, like a freedom fighter taking on a massive imperial military and a corrupt corporate megachurch simultaneously.
That's a great way to summarize it. The author describes the situation in first-century Judea as a dual tyranny.
A dual tyranny.
And to understand the author's argument, we have to look at the historical context Parwez is analyzing. Jesus' mission, according to this framework, was open, calculated rebellion against 2 deeply intertwined forces.
Okay, what were they?
First, you had the Roman imperial administration. Rome represented ultimate political oppression, military occupation, and devastating economic extraction through heavy taxation.
And Rome didn't just collect taxes politely.
No, not at all.
It was an extractive empire that basically bled its provinces dry to fund the capital.
Exactly. But Rome couldn't manage the local population alone. And that brings us to the second half of the dual tyranny.
The local partners.
Right, the exploitative Jewish religious establishment. The Quranic text refers to these groups using the Arabic terms Abar and Reuben.
Okay, let's define those terms because they are crucial to the argument we're building here. What are the Abar and the Reuben in this specific historical context?
In Parwez's analysis, the Abar were the religious scholars, the jurists, the ones who monopolized the interpretation of religious law.
The academics, almost.
Yes. And the Reuben were the monks, the ascetics, or the temple priests who monopolized spiritual rituals.
Okay.
Together, they represented an absolute economic and spiritual monopoly. The source argues that these religious leaders essentially acted as middlemen for the Roman Empire. They kept the population pacified with complex religious rituals while hoarding vast amounts of wealth in the temple treasury and denying basic rights to the poor.
So according to this text, Jesus wasn't just walking around trying to save individual souls for the afterlife.
No.
He was trying to liberate the Israelites from Roman slavery and systematically purge the moral and economic corruption of these priests. The text is claiming his goal was to reestablish din, a system of actual, tangible equity.
Yes, exactly. And this brings us to a highly technical but absolutely critical redefinition in the source material, the concept of kufr.
Kufra, right. Because if anyone has a basic passing knowledge of Islamic terminology, they know the word kufr.
Usually, yeah.
Traditionally, it just means disbelief, right? Like a personal internal state of not believing in a specific theology or denying a specific religious truth.
That is the standard traditional translation, yes.
Yeah.
But the Kitab framework redefines kufr systemically, going back to its classical Arabic root.
What's the root?
The root of the word literally means to cover up or to conceal, like a farmer covering seeds with dirt.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So Parwez argues that in the Quranic context of these historical clashes, kufr is not merely personal religious disbelief.
Okay.
A guy sitting in his house quietly doubting a sermon is not committing kufr in this socio-political sense.
So what is it then, if it's not just disbelief?
The source defines kufr as an organized, systemic, political, and religious conspiracy that actively works to cover up or suppress the equitable system of din.
Oh, wow.
It is the vested interest protecting their monopolies. And crucially, the text notes that this systemic kufr inevitably breaks out into open, violent hostility when it feels threatened.
Wait, so it's not just someone saying, I don't believe your theology.
No.
It's the establishment. The ruling class looking at this movement of equity, looking at the demand for rububiyat, that guaranteed sustenance we talked about, and saying, your movement is going to bankrupt us. It's going to destroy our control over the masses, and therefore we're going to use the power of the state to crush you.
You've hit the nail on the head. The elites, both the Roman military prefects and the religious Abar and Ruban, they recognized Jesus' movement not as a minor theological disagreement, but as a direct existential threat.
The threat to their bottom line.
Their economic monopolies and their political power. They saw that if he successfully established din, their lucrative dualism would just collapse.
Right.
The temple wouldn't be able to extort the poor, and Rome wouldn't have compliant subjects. This organized institutional resistance, the systemic pushback to maintain inequity, is what the text identifies as kufr.
That completely flips the definition.
It does. And according to the author, it is this economic and political friction that led to the ultimate inevitable clash.
Okay, so let me pause and play this out logically. If Jesus was actually a revolutionary leader trying to dismantle a dual tyranny of an empire and a corrupt priesthood, well, a revolutionary leader needs a revolutionary vanguard.
Natural.
You cannot overthrow the Roman Empire and the temple elite by yourself. So if Jesus wasn't a passive monk wandering alone, who were his followers? Because the traditional historical story we've all heard absolutely does not paint his inner circle as hardened revolutionaries.
That is a brilliant transition because the source material spends a significant amount of time offering a radical, almost aggressive defense of the disciples.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It points out that the accepted Christian historical narratives, which, remember, Parwez considers to be the corrupted texts of Mazhab written long after the fact, they essentially slander the disciples.
Yeah, if you read the accepted accounts, the disciples are almost always portrayed as bumbling, confused, or deeply fearful.
Exactly.
They're literally called men of little faith. They never seem to understand what's going on when Jesus is talking to them.
Right. They are painted as cowardly men who abandon their leader at the very first sign of real state violence.
Which is pretty damning.
The source specifically highlights the famous gospel accounts where Peter, the supposed rock of the early church, denies even knowing Jesus 3 times out of sheer terror before the rooster crows.
Yeah, the denial.
And it points out how the narrative claims the rest of the followers simply scattered into the night when the armed authorities arrived at the garden to arrest him.
When you frame it like that, I mean, it makes you think, imagine reading a history book about a massive rebellion. But the book is written entirely by the empire that successfully crushed the rebellion.
Exactly. Who is writing the history?
Right. Of course, they would paint the rebel lieutenants as cowards. Why would Rome, or the establishment religious elite who later assimilated the religion, write a history praising the incredible bravery and discipline of the people who tried to overthrow their economy.
They wouldn't.
They want the masses to read the story and think, see, rebellion is useless. Even the founders ran away.
That is exactly the political motive the author assigns to the traditional narratives. The goal of mazhab is to pacify. What better way to pacify a population than to write the foundational heroes of the faith as passive, fearful men who ultimately submitted to state violence?
But here is my question for you. This is where I really need to push back on Parwez's methodology for a second.
Go for it.
How does the source justify just tossing out the accepted historical texts? I mean, we have ancient manuscripts. How does the author just say, no, Peter didn't deny him, the disciples didn't run away, they were actually brave? Isn't it incredibly convenient to just say, oh, history got it wrong, to fit a modern political theory?
That is the core epistemological question of this entire deep dive. How do we know what is true?
Right.
To answer your question, we have to look at the specific framework Parwez uses. The source does not rely on finding hidden alternate first-century scrolls in a cave somewhere. It relies entirely on a Quranic framework, specifically zooming in on the Arabic text of Surah Al-Imran, verses 52 and 53. The methodology here is key. The text operates on the foundational premise that human written histories are inherently shaped by the vested interests of the rulers who commissioned them.
So human history is biased by default.
Exactly. Therefore, Parwez positions the Quran as the supreme historical verifier.
The ultimate divine fact-checker.
Yes. The theological argument of the source is that one of the primary purposes of the Quran is to correct these fabricated empire-sponsored histories and to restore the honorable revolutionary legacy of the prophets and their companions.
Okay, I see.
So when Parwez's text looks at verse 52, it translates the historical moment of the confrontation completely differently than the traditional story.
Walk me through that moment. What happens in verse 52 according to this translation?
The verse describes the climax of the conflict. It says that when Jesus sensed the organized opposition, that systemic, hostile coup we just talked about, breaking out into open, undeniable hostility, he didn't cower.
He didn't just accept it.
He didn't resign himself to passive martyrdom. He issued a direct, strategic call to action to his inner circle. He asked, "Who are my helpers in the cause of Allah?" Meaning, who is going to stand with me to establish this system of din against the state?
And according to this source, the disciples didn't flee into the night.
No, they boldly stepped forward. The text uses the specific classical Arabic term Hawariyyun for the disciples.
Hawariyyun.
The root of this word implies purity, sincerity, and those who are chosen for a vital task. And in response to Jesus' call, the Hawariyyun declared themselves to be Ansarullah.
Ansarullah, meaning?
Which translates to the helpers of the divine system. The author describes them not as a loose band of fishermen, but as a fearless, highly disciplined revolutionary vanguard.
Not a group of wandering beggars, but an organized ideological front line ready to take on the establishment.
Precisely. And the text continues into verse 53, where this vanguard makes a formal pledge. They ask God to write them down among the El-Shahidin.
The El-Shahidin.
Now, traditionally, this word is translated simply as the witnesses.
Right, because in common parlance, a witness usually just means someone who saw something happen, like a bystander in a courtroom. Or in a religious context, maybe someone who just verbally professes a creed. Like, I bear witness that this theology is true.
Exactly. But again, the author argues that mazhab has watered down the vocabulary. In the robust framework of din, Parwez argues that being a witness, being among the al-Shahidin, means offering physical, practical, undeniable evidence of the ideology, even at the cost of your own life.
Wow.
It demands concrete action, ultimate sacrifice, and the willingness to shed blood to make the equitable system a tangible societal reality. It is not passive observation. It is active validation through struggle.
That is a massive elevation in status for the disciples. It completely changes their historical legacy from cowards to heroes.
The text actually goes so far as to structurally equate the bravery and discipline of Jesus' Hawariyyun to the Sahaba.
Prophet Muhammad's closest companions.
Yes. Specifically, Parwez compares this moment to a highly critical historical event in Islamic history called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah.
For the listener who might not be familiar with Islamic history, why is that comparison so significant? What happened at Hudaybiyah?
At Hudaybiyah, Prophet Muhammad and a relatively small group of his companions were facing down a massive, heavily armed force from Mecca.
Okay, so they were outgunned.
Completely. They were essentially unarmed in hostile territory, and it looked like they were going to be slaughtered. In that moment of extreme peril, the companions didn't flee. They gathered under a tree and placed their hands over the prophet's hand, swearing a pledge of absolute allegiance,
A pledge to fight.
promising to fight to the death if necessary to protect the movement. It is considered the ultimate display of vanguard discipline and loyalty. By equating the disciples of Jesus to the companions at Hudaybiyah, Parwez is saying these were not cowards. These were elite, ideologically unbreakable revolutionaries.
Okay, I am tracking with the logic of the argument. But it brings up a massive, glaring question for me. If the disciples were actually this brave, and if the movement was actually this active, highly organized, and revolutionary, how in the world did the narrative shift so drastically? Like, how do we get from a fearless, disciplined vanguard fighting an empire to the passive ascetics sitting in monasteries that we read about in the history books?
The source argues that this massive historical shift did not happen by accident. It happened through the subtle, deliberate, and highly politically motivated mistranslation of language over centuries.
Yes, translation.
Yes. When the active system of din is converted into the passive religion of mazhab by empires who want to co-opt the faith, the very vocabulary of the texts is weaponized against the people. To uncover the historical truth, the author says we have to engage in what we could call linguistic decontamination.
Linguistic decontamination. I love that phrase. That is so good.
It's exactly what Parwez does. He argues that over centuries, as the language transitioned from ancient dialects to classical Arabic, and then was interpreted through the lens of Persian, Hellenistic, and later Urdu thought, the original revolutionary sting of the words was deliberately dulled.
So they basically smoothed out all the rough edges.
They changed the dictionaries. So, to prove his point, the author takes us through the classical Arabic roots of 3 highly misunderstood words in these specific Quranic verses.
Okay, this is absolutely my favorite part of this deep dive, the aha moments of translation. Because when you change the foundational definition of a single word in a text, you can change the entire trajectory of the story, the theology, and the political implications.
Absolutely.
Let's look at the first word the source meticulously breaks down. The word is Makr.
Yes, Makr. This word appears in verse 54. The verse essentially says the opponents planned a Makr, and God also planned a Makr, and God is the best of planners. Now, the source points out that traditionally, and Parwez notes this is particularly problematic in later Persian and Urdu translations, Makr is almost universally translated as deception, trickery, or malicious plotting.
Which, if we just pause and think about it for 5 seconds, creates a massive theological headache.
Right, huge one.
Because if the opponents planned a deception, and God also planned a deception, you are essentially saying in your holy book that God is a deceiver, a trickster.
Exactly. And that inherently contradicts the foundational concept of a just, moral, and transparent divine entity. How can a system based on universal equity and truth be led by a God who uses malicious trickery?
Right, makes no sense.
Parwez argues this is a fatal flaw in the traditional translation. He argues that if you strip away the centuries of linguistic corruption and go back to the true, neutral, classical Arabic root of the word, Makr does not mean deception.
What does it mean?
It simply means subtle, highly secret strategic planning. It doesn't inherently carry a negative moral weight. It's just covert strategy. It is logistics.
It's a tactical term.
Precise.
So in the context of the historical story of Jesus facing down the Roman and Jewish elite, what does that translation change actually mean for the narrative? Like, how does the story play out now?
Well, it changes everything. It means the religious and political elites formulated a Makr, a highly classified, secret political conspiracy to arrest Jesus in the dead of night and execute him via crucifixion.
Right.
They didn't just want him dead. They wanted to publicly humiliate him with a method of execution that the society considered cursed. The goal of their Makr was to completely destroy the psychological momentum of his revolutionary movement by making a brutal example of him.
But the verse says God countered with a superior Makr.
Yeah.
So if Makr means strategy, then Makr isn't God using magic to trick the Romans. It's God, or the divine system, playing 4D chess against a corrupt empire.
I would use an even more concrete structural analogy. Think of it less like a divine magic trick and more like witnessing the establishment of an underground railroad. Or a highly sophisticated witness protection program. It's calculated covert logistics to protect a high-value revolutionary target. According to the text, God's Makr was a protective protocol. It was a highly secretive, strategic migration to safely relocate Jesus out of the reach of the authorities.
They smuggle them out.
Exactly. Parwez draws a direct structural parallel here to Prophet Muhammad's secret migration, the Hijra, from Mecca to Medina when he was facing an organized assassination plot by the Meccan elites.
That makes perfect sense.
Right. Both were strategic, physical relocations to preserve the leadership of the movement.
Which brings us to the second word the source analyzes, mutawaffa.
Yeah.
This word appears in verse 55, where God is speaking to Jesus about his fate.
Mm-hmm.
Because the traditional story, which has been heavily influenced by centuries of later mythology, suggests that Jesus escaped the cross through supernatural intervention.
Right.
Like some traditions say he was swapped out at the last second and someone else was made to look like him, or that he used magic to bypass death entirely.
Parwez vehemently rejects all of that. He calls it Hellenistic and mythological corruption that seeped into the texts. The source analyzes the root of mutawaffa.
What does it mean?
The root essentially means to receive something in full, or to complete a term. Therefore, Parwez translates mutawaffa simply as a divine guarantee of a natural physical death at the end of a completed lifespan.
So God is saying, you are going to die because you're human, but not today. And not like this.
Exactly. The divine promise was that Jesus would complete his natural term of life and would not suffer the plotted, humiliating, unnatural death of crucifixion at the hands of his oppressors. He was to be left physically pure from their violence.
Okay.
The text argues that the obsession with magic tricks and body swapping actually distracts from the political reality of the moment, which was a successful evasion of state execution.
Okay, but then we hit the third word in the linguistic analysis, and I have to say, this is the most dramatic, paradigm-shattering reinterpretation of all.
It really is.
The word is Rafa. Because for over a millennium, the widely accepted translation of Rafa in this specific context is physical levitation.
Floating into the sky.
Right. The idea that Jesus ascended alive, bodily, defying gravity, up into the clouds, into the fourth heaven to escape the Romans.
The author completely deconstructs this translation. The source states that based on Quranic usage and classical Arabic roots, Rafa does not mean physical lifting into the air.
It doesn't mean flying.
No. It strictly means elevation of status, ranks, honor, and dignity.
Wait, hold on. Let me step into the shoes of a skeptical listener here.
Yeah.
For centuries, billions of people across multiple major world religions have accepted some form of the physical ascension of Jesus.
Yes, they have.
Entire theologies are built on it. So how does the author actually prove this linguistic root isn't just, a subjective twist to fit his rationalist theory? How can one framework claim everyone else is just reading a fantasy novel?
It is a massive claim, and Parwez backs it up with a profound theological argument that goes far beyond just dictionary definitions. He asks us to look at the logical implications of the translation.
Okay, what are the implications?
What's fascinating here is the theological collateral damage of translating Rafa as physical levitation. The author argues that assigning a physical spatial location to godlike saying God is up there in the sky, in the fourth heaven, waiting to pull Jesus up, fundamentally contradicts the core, non-negotiable Quranic concept of divine omnipresence.
Right, the famous idea that God is everywhere, famously described as being closer to you than your jugular vein.
Precisely. Parwez poses a logical problem. If the divine is closer than your jugular vein, where exactly is Jesus ascending to?
Oh, wow.
Right. To say Jesus was physically elevated into outer space is to confine the infinite divine to a finite spatial dimension. The author argues that this idea of a tiered universe with God sitting on a physical throne in the sky is a mythological corruption imported from ancient Greek and Persian religions. It's not a Quranic concept. God didn't beam Jesus into a spaceship.
So if it's not physical, what is the Rafa? What is the elevation?
God elevated his historical honor, his moral stature, and his ideological legacy far above the conspirators who tried to humiliate him.
It's the ultimate historical vindication. Like, the empire tried to execute him as a common criminal to literally erase his name from history, and instead, history made him one of the most revered prophets to ever live. God preserved his dignity.
And Parwez points out that this promise of Rafa, this elevation of status, was historically tangibly fulfilled a few decades later.
When?
When the Roman military forces besieged and destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, they effectively dismantled the very Jewish priesthood, the Abar and Reuben, and the monopolies that had conspired against Jesus.
Oh, the destruction of the temple?
Yes, the oppressors were ruined, their temple was destroyed, and the truthful messenger status was exalted globally. That is the true Rafa.
Wow. Okay, so we have decoded the historical context, we have rescued the disciples from being painted as cowards, and we have decontaminated the language to reveal a story of grounded strategic maneuvers rather than mythological gravity-defying escapes.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
But now, we must ask the crucial "so what" question.
Right.
What is the operational blueprint this source extracts for modern society? Because reading Parwez, it's very clear this isn't just an academic exercise in ancient history. He is trying to build something for today.
Absolutely. The text is presented as a highly practical, urgent framework for today. It extracts several concrete structural action items for transitioning a society from that passive, oppressive state of mazhab back to the active, equitable system of din.
So if we accept this framework, how does a society actually do that? How do you dismantle the dual tyranny today?
Well, the first step Parwez derives from the text is the absolute necessity of dismantling monopolies, specifically religious ones.
Okay.
The source calls for eradicating the socio-economic and political influence of professional religious elites.
Meaning no one gets to charge you for a ticket to heaven.
Exactly. Anyone who acts as a gatekeeper to salvation or uses the garb of piety to exploit the masses must be structurally removed from power. There can be no private religious tribunals that manipulate faith to consolidate wealth or avoid taxes. The priesthood must be abolished as a profession.
And if you remove the religious half of the dual tyranny, you have to address the state half.
Right, which leads to the second principle, unifying sovereignty.
Unifying sovereignty.
So you have to abolish that secular dualism we talked about at the beginning. The text argues you must establish a unified socio-economic system where equitable, ethical laws govern all reality.
You can't separate Sunday from Monday.
Exactly. You cannot have a state that ruthlessly exploits the working class from Monday to Friday while the citizens go to a building on Sunday to preach about kindness. That is pure hypocrisy. Sustenance, that concept of rubaiyat, must be guaranteed systemically by the state as a fundamental human right.
Not handed out as charity.
Right, not tax-deductible charity to a subjugated population. It's a right.
But you can't just hope the system changes on its own right. The empire doesn't just hand over the keys because you asked nicely.
Which is why the third step is the cultivation of an active vanguard. Just as Jesus called for his Hawariyyun, modern society requires cultivating a disciplined group, an ansarullah, ready to practically enforce this equitable system. And the text is explicit. This means totally rejecting passive asceticism or monasticism.
You cannot change the world by retreating to a cave and meditating.
Exactly. You must engage with the messy socio-political reality. You have to be in the marketplace, in the courts, in the government.
But if you do all of that, if you dismantle the monopolies, unify the sovereignty, and build a vanguard, the empire is going to strike back.
Of course.
History shows us that vested interests do not go quietly.
And Parwez's framework is very realistic about this. When facing severe systemic persecution, the instruction derived from the text is to execute protective protocols. Use Makr.
Strategic planning.
Yes. Do not rely on supernatural intervention. Do not sit around waiting for a miracle to save you or to be levitated into the clouds. Instead, use subtle, highly secretive counter-strategies, logistics, and strategic migration to preserve the ideological movement and protect its leadership. You have to outplan the oppressor.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about the classical Arabic root of a word from a millennia ago?
It's a fair question.
Because this text is acting as a structural manual. It is telling you that hoping for a magical intervention to solve societal inequity is a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. The text demands human action, strategy, organization, and a relentless, uncompromising focus on economic fairness.
And this all culminates in what Parwez identifies in verse 3.57 as the universal law of Adl, or just return.
As it returns.
The text extracts a systemic, almost scientific promise from the verse, that constructive human effort aimed at establishing equity will always be compensated justly, free from the extraction of ruling elites.
But that promise also comes with a stark warning for the elites.
Yes, it does. The inevitable consequence of standing up for equitable laws is systemic persecution by that unholy alliance of ruling elites and religious monopolies. However, the author synthesizes a core, unshakable belief from these verses.
What is it?
The ultimate moral arc of history, what the text calls the divine laws of societal mechanics, guarantees that oppressors, termed the Zalimin, or those who misplace justice, will inevitably collapse under the weight of their own historical contradictions.
The system of extraction eventually runs out of things to extract.
Precisely. The exploiters will eventually be ruined by the natural mechanics of history, just as the Roman and Jewish establishments of that era eventually fell, while human effort aligned with justice and din will never go unrewarded.
Wow. Let's take a deep breath. We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
We moved from the passive submission of Mazhab, where you're just a Sunday user of a monopoly's sandboxed app, to the active, equitable operating system of din. We completely reimagined the historical figure of Jesus, moving him from a passive monk to a socio-political revolutionary fighting a dual tyranny.
Right.
We rescued his disciples from the slander of history, recognizing them as a fearless, disciplined vanguard. And perhaps most importantly, we decontaminated language, turning deceptive magic into strategic logistics and physical levitation into the ultimate elevation of historical honor.
It is a framework that completely reframes the human narrative, from one of passive victimhood waiting for rescue to one of active revolutionary agency building a better world.
To you listening, thank you for engaging with us. We know this is dense, perspective-altering material. It requires you to challenge things you might have assumed were basic facts. But there is immense liberating value in questioning our foundational definitions. Because as we have seen today, changing the definition of a single word can change everything we think we know about history, power, theology, and our own agency to affect change.
And that leaves us with a final lingering thought to explore on your own.
Okay, let's hear it.
If, as this source suggests, the greatest, most effective weapon of oppressive systems is simply redefining the vocabulary of liberation into a vocabulary of passive submission.
Yeah.
What words in our own modern societal dictionary have been subtly rewritten to keep us passive today? When politicians or leaders use words like freedom, justice, or charity, what are they actually trying to cover up? What definitions are you accepting without question?
Wow. Something to mull over as you walk past the marble statues in the Museum of History. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.